Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The autumn of 2015 had been particularly cruel to our family. I was 26 then, a young mother trying to hold everything together as our world seemed to crumble around us. My husband Thomas had fallen from a construction scaffold just 6 weeks earlier, his left leg shattered in 3 places. The doctors said he was lucky to keep it, but luck felt like a foreign concept as I watched him struggle with crutches and pain medication that barely touched the agony. Our half-finished log cabin sat like a wounded animal in the clearing we'd carved from the Pennsylvania wilderness. The walls were up, the roof mostly complete, but the interior remained a maze of exposed beams and subflooring. We'd been living there for 8 months, stubborn in our determination to make it work despite having no running water upstairs and only basic electrical hookups. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles away through dense forest, and the main road felt like another world entirely. Thomas's disability checks weren't enough. They barely covered the mortgage on the land, let alone food for our 4-year-old son Christopher or the medical bills that kept arriving in our rusted mailbox. I'd spent 3 weeks calling every business within 20 miles, desperate for work that would accommodate my complete lack of experience and my need to be home during the day while Thomas couldn't properly watch our son. The answer came from Hartwell Manufacturing, a furniture factory on the outskirts of town that ran 3 shifts to keep up with orders. The night shift paid an extra $1 per hour, money we desperately needed, but it meant leaving Thomas and Christopher alone in our isolated home from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. The thought terrified me, but the alternative was losing everything we'd worked for. Our property sat at the base of Copper Ridge, accessible only by a winding gravel driveway that snaked through a 1/4 mile of thick woods before opening into our clearing. To reach civilization, you had to navigate back through those trees, turn left onto Pine Creek Road, a narrow country lane that connected several remote properties, then merge onto Route 47, the 2-lane highway that eventually led to town. It was a lonely drive even in daylight. At night, with only my headlights cutting through the darkness, it felt like traveling through a void. The trees pressed in from both sides, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even on clear nights you couldn't see stars. I'd made the drive dozens of times since starting the job 3 weeks ago, but I never got used to the isolation, the way the darkness seemed to swallow my car whole once I left the faint glow of our porch light behind. That Friday night felt different from the moment I started my car. October had brought an unseasonable cold snap, and frost was already forming on my windshield, despite it being only mid-month. I scraped it clear with a credit card, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees since afternoon, and the weather forecast predicted it might hit freezing before morning. Thomas had been in particularly bad pain that day, the cold seeming to settle deep into his broken bones. He'd spent most of the afternoon on the couch with his leg elevated, popping pain pills and trying to keep Christopher entertained with coloring books and children's shows on our ancient television. I'd prepared dinner, helped Christopher with his bath, and gotten him settled for the night before gathering my things for work. "Drive careful," Thomas had said as I kissed him goodbye, his voice thick with medication. "Call when you get there." I promised I would, though cell service was spotty until you reached the main highway. Our phone was a landline in the kitchen, and Thomas would often fall asleep on the couch, so I'd taken to calling my supervisor instead to confirm I'd arrived safely. The gravel driveway crunched under my tires as I navigated the familiar route through the woods. My car, a 15-year-old sedan with over 200,000 miles, wheezed and rattled as it climbed the slight incline toward Pine Creek Road. The headlights illuminated the same landmarks I'd memorized: the lightning split oak, the rusted gate from some long-abandoned property line, the cluster of white birch trees that marked the halfway point. When I reached the end of our driveway, I paused as always to check for oncoming traffic on Pine Creek Road. It was a blind curve in both directions, and I'd learned to listen carefully for engine sounds before pulling out. Tonight, the silence was absolute. No distant hum of traffic, no night birds, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The quiet was so complete it felt pressed against my eardrums. I turned left onto the narrow asphalt road, my tires finding the familiar rhythm of expansion joints and small potholes. The route to Route 47 was exactly 3.2 miles of winding road that followed the creek bed down from the ridge. During the day, it was actually pretty fern. The water sparkled through the trees, and you could sometimes spot deer or wild turkeys. At night, it became a tunnel of shadows punctuated only by my headlight beams and the occasional reflective glint of animal eyes watching from the forest. The intersection where Pine Creek Road met Route 47 had always been a point of anxiety for me. It was a three-way stop with limited visibility, especially at night. The road coming down from the ridge, Copper Ridge Road, descended at a steep angle, and drivers often approached the intersection too fast. I'd seen the skid marks on the asphalt, evidence of vehicles that had misjudged the stop. But tonight, as I rounded the final bend before the intersection, something was wrong. Taillights glowed red in the darkness ahead, positioned exactly where a car would be if it had stopped at the sign. But they weren't positioned correctly. The vehicle was sitting too far back from the intersection, blocking the normal stopping point for traffic from Pine Creek Road. I slowed my car to a crawl, trying to understand what I was seeing. The vehicle ahead appeared to be a dark pickup truck, larger than my sedan, sitting motionless with its engine running. No hazard lights blinked. No turn signals indicated an intended direction. It simply sat there, occupying the road in a way that prevented me from reaching the stop sign. I stopped my car about 20 feet behind the truck, close enough to see it clearly but far enough to maintain what I thought was a safe distance. The exhaust from the truck's tailpipe created small clouds in the cold air, and I could hear the rumble of its engine even through my closed windows. Minutes passed. The truck didn't move. I considered backing up and turning around, but Pine Creek Road was narrow with no shoulder, and dense trees pressed right up to the asphalt. There was nowhere to turn around until you reached someone's driveway, and I'd have to back up nearly half a mile in the dark to reach the first one. Besides, I was already running late for my shift, and taking the long way around would add another 20 minutes to my commute. I waited, assuming the driver was having some mechanical difficulty, or perhaps dealing with a medical emergency. I considered honking my horn but worried that might seem rude if they were genuinely in distress. Small-town courtesy ran deep, and you didn't want to alienate neighbors when you lived so far from anyone else. Then the driver's door opened, and my stomach tightened with the first real stab of fear. The man who emerged was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothing that made him blend with the shadows. Even in my headlight beams I couldn't make out his face clearly, but his posture radiated a kind of predatory confidence that made every instinct in my body scream warnings. He moved with purpose, not the hesitant shuffle of someone genuinely in need of help. As he approached my car, I noticed he kept glancing around, checking the road in both directions, looking into the woods as if watching for something. His steps were measured, deliberate. This wasn't random behavior. This was calculated. My hands gripped the steering wheel as the stranger approached my driver's side window. Every nerve in my body was firing warnings, but years of small-town politeness fought against my instincts. You helped people in rural areas. You stopped for someone with car trouble. You didn't assume the worst of folks, even strangers. But something about this man's approach set off alarms that I couldn't ignore. He moved like a predator, each step purposeful and measured. When he reached my window, he bent down to peer inside, and I caught a glimpse of his face in the reflection of my dashboard lights. His features were hard, weathered, with small dark eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. He looked to be in his 40s, with the build of someone who worked with his hands, but there was something else, a coldness in his expression that made my skin crawl. I cracked my window perhaps 2 inches, enough to hear him speak but nowhere near enough for him to reach through. The November air rushed in carrying the scent of exhaust and something else, cigarettes and unwashed clothing. "Evening," he said, his voice gravelly and rough. "Having some car trouble here." "I'm sorry to hear that," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "Is there anything I can do to help?" But even as I said the words, my mind was processing the inconsistencies. His truck's taillights were bright and steady. The engine was running smoothly. If he was having electrical problems, his lights would be dim or flickering. If he'd run out of gas, the engine wouldn't be running at all. "Just need a jump," he said, glancing back at his truck and then into my back seat. "Got cables?" The lie was so obvious it almost insulted my intelligence. His headlights were burning bright, clearly visible in my rearview mirror. His engine was running strong enough that I could hear it over my own car's idle. No one with a functioning electrical system needed a jump start. "I don't have jumper cables." I said. Which was true. But more importantly, I wasn't about to get out of my car to look, even if I had them. You sure? He pressed, moving slightly closer to my window. Could you just pop the trunk and check? Sometimes people got 'em and don't know it. The suggestion sent ice through my veins. He wanted me out of the car. He wanted me vulnerable and exposed in the darkness of this isolated intersection. Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get away, to put distance between myself and this situation. I'm certain I don't have any, I said firmly. I'm sorry, but I'm late for work. I need to get going. His demeanor shifted then, the thin veneer of politeness falling away like a shed skin. His voice dropped to something harder, more commanding. Come on, lady. Just get out and look. Won't take but a minute. The transformation was terrifying. This wasn't a request anymore. It was a demand. The tone was one of barely controlled anger, as if my refusal to comply was a personal insult. I could feel my heart rate spiking, adrenaline beginning to flood my system. I can't help you, I said, my voice rising slightly. I need to go. That's when I saw the shadow move past my passenger window. My blood went cold as I turned to see a second man attempting to open my passenger door, his hand already on the handle. He was smaller than the first man, but younger, maybe in his 20s, with the lean build of someone accustomed to violence. The interior light didn't come on when he tried the handle. I disabled it months ago to preserve my night vision during these late drives, but I could see his silhouette clearly against the darkness of the woods beyond. The trap was fully revealed now. This had never been about car trouble. The positioning of the truck, blocking my access to the intersection, the request to get out of my car, the second man waiting in the shadows. It was all carefully orchestrated. They had probably done this before, maybe many times, targeting lone drivers on isolated roads. Terror crashed over me like a physical force. I was alone on a dark country road with two men who clearly intended me harm. The nearest house was miles away. No one expected me at work for another 40 minutes. Thomas was home with Christopher, probably asleep from his pain medication, and wouldn't know anything was wrong until I failed to call at my usual time. My hands shook as I slammed the car into drive, my foot already moving toward the accelerator. The first man, realizing his plan was falling apart, became more aggressive. Hey, he shouted, grabbing at my partially open window with both hands. You can't just leave. His fingers clawed at the glass, trying to force the window down further. I could smell his breath now. Stale beer and something rotten, like meat that had gone bad. Up close, his face was even more terrifying, twisted with rage at being denied his prey. The second man abandoned any pretense of stealth and began yanking on my passenger door handle with increasing violence. The car rocked slightly with his efforts, and I could hear him cursing under his breath. The sound of his voice, younger but filled with the same predatory hunger as his companion, made my stomach turn. I gunned the engine and yanked the steering wheel hard to the left, my tires squealing as they fought for traction on the cold asphalt. The first man was forced to release my window, or risk being dragged alongside the car. I caught a glimpse of his face in my headlights as I swerved around the truck, eyes wide with fury, mouth open in a shout I couldn't hear over the roar of my engine. The passenger door handle slipped from the second man's grasp as I accelerated, and I saw him stumble backward in my side mirror. For a terrifying moment, I thought he might recover and chase after me, but the gap was widening too quickly. I flew through the intersection without stopping, without looking, my only thought to put distance between myself and those men. If another car had been coming from either direction, we would have collided. But luck was with me. The roads were empty, as they almost always were this late on a weeknight. My car's engine screamed as I pushed it harder than I ever had before, taking curves that I normally navigated carefully at dangerous speeds. The speedometer needle climbed past 60, then 70. On roads designed for 40 at most, trees flashed by in a blur of shadows, and I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. In my rearview mirror, I could see headlights following me, the truck's bright beams gaining ground despite my reckless speed. They were pursuing me, and their vehicle was more powerful than my aging sedan. The realization that the danger wasn't over, that they hadn't simply given up and moved on to wait for the next victim, sent fresh waves of terror through my system. My mind raced as fast as my engine. They knew these roads as well as I did, maybe better. If they caught up to me on one of the long straight stretches ahead, they could force me off the road or ram me from behind. My car was already struggling with the speed I was demanding from it. I could hear the engine straining, feel the steering wheel vibrating with the effort. I needed to get off Route 47, but my options were limited. Most of the side roads led to dead ends or looped back to the main highway eventually. But there was one route I knew well, a back road that wound around Hillcrest Golf Course before connecting with the industrial district where I worked. It would add time to my commute, but it would also be completely unexpected. When I saw the turnoff for Meadowbrook Drive, I made my decision. Without signaling or slowing down visibly, I yanked the wheel hard to the right, my tires screaming in protest as they fought to maintain their grip on the asphalt. The sudden turn threw me against my door, and I fought to control the car as it fishtailed slightly before straightening out. The pursuing headlights shot past the turnoff, the truck's driver apparently not anticipating such an abrupt maneuver. I watched in my mirror as their brake lights flashed and they began to slow, probably looking for a place to turn around, but I was already disappearing into the network of residential streets that surrounded the golf course. My breathing came in ragged gasps as I navigated the familiar route at a more reasonable speed. The manicured lawns and sleeping houses felt like a different world from the nightmare I'd just escaped. Porch lights glowed warmly in windows, and I could see the blue flicker of televisions in some living rooms. Normal life, safe life, continued obliviously while I trembled behind the wheel of my car. It wasn't until I'd put several miles between myself and the intersection that the full impact of what had just happened began to sink in. Those men had been waiting for someone like me, alone, vulnerable, traveling a predictable route at a predictable time. How many others had they attacked? How many had been less fortunate than I was? The questions multiplied in my mind, each more disturbing than the last. Had they been watching our property, learning my schedule? Did they know where I lived, where my family slept? The isolation that had once seemed like peaceful privacy now felt like dangerous exposure. By the time I reached the Hartwell manufacturing parking lot, my entire body was shaking. The familiar sight of the factory, a sprawling single-story building surrounded by employee cars and illuminated by harsh sodium lights, felt like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Security lights, other people, the safety of civilization. I sat in my car for several minutes after turning off the engine, trying to compose myself before going inside. My face was streaked with tears I didn't remember shedding, and my hands were still trembling from the adrenaline. When I tried to gather my purse and lunch bag from the passenger seat, I noticed dark smudges on my window where the first man had grabbed at it, physical evidence of how close I'd come to whatever they had planned for me. The factory's night shift was already in full swing when I finally made it inside. The familiar sounds of machinery and conveyor belts should have been comforting, but instead they seemed muffled and distant, as if I were hearing them through water. Everything felt surreal, disconnected from the normal world I thought I knew. Louise Henderson, the floor supervisor, noticed me immediately. Louise was in her 50s, a grandmother who'd worked at the factory for over 20 years and had a maternal instinct for troubled employees. "Honey, what's wrong?" she asked, taking one look at my face and guiding me to her small office behind the production floor. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The concern in her voice broke down the fragile composure I'd been trying to maintain. The story poured out of me in a rush. The stopped truck, the two men, the pursuit, my desperate escape. Louise listened with growing alarm, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the location and the men's appearance. "We need to call the police," she said firmly when I finished. "Right now." She dialed 911 from her office phone, while I sat in a hard plastic chair, still shaking. The dispatcher took a detailed report, asking for descriptions of the men and their vehicle, the exact location of the incident, and the time it had occurred. They promised to send a patrol car to check the intersection, though I doubted the men would still be there. Next, Louise helped me call Thomas. Our home phone rang 6 times before he answered, his voice thick with sleep and medication. "Thomas, it's me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm at work, but something happened on the way here." I gave him a shortened version of events, not wanting to terrify him more than necessary. He was immediately alert, the sleep vanishing from his voice as he processed what I was telling him. "Oh God," he whispered. "Are you hurt? Are you safe?" "I'm fine," I assured him. "I'm at the factory. Louise is here with me. The police are checking it out." "You're not driving home alone," he said firmly. "I'll figure something out. Maybe I can get Jerry to follow you partway, or we'll figure it out in the morning." I interrupted. Right now I just need to work and try to process this. But even as I said it, I knew sleep would be impossible when I got home. The images kept replaying in my mind. The predatory way the first man had moved. The desperation in the second man attempts to get into my car. The pursuing headlights in my rearview mirror. The 8-hour shift stretched endlessly ahead of me. Louise had offered to let me go home. But the thought of making that drive again so soon was unbearable. At least here I was surrounded by people, by light, by the ordinary noise of productivity. The factory floor became my refuge, the repetitive work a meditation that helped keep the fear at bay. But my mind wouldn't quiet completely. Every time the production line paused or the machinery cycled down, the silence brought back memories of that absolute quiet on Pine Creek Road before I'd encountered the truck. Every time someone approached me from behind or spoke unexpectedly, I jumped like a startled animal. My coworkers were kind. Word spread quickly through the small night crew about what had happened, and people I barely knew stopped by to check on me, to share their own stories of close calls on country roads, to offer rides home or phone numbers I could call if I needed anything. Their concern was touching, but it also reinforced how real the danger had been. Around 3 in the morning, one of the security guards found me during my break and told me a police officer had stopped by to follow up on my report. They'd found no sign of the truck or the men at the intersection, but they were increasing patrols in the area and had alerted nearby departments to watch for similar incidents. "You did the right thing, getting out of there," the guard said. "These things, they don't usually end well when people don't trust their instincts." His words should have been reassuring, but instead they highlighted how close I'd come to becoming a statistic, another case file in some detective's cabinet. The factory's fluorescent lights suddenly seemed too bright, too harsh, and I found myself looking toward the windows, wondering if those men were out there somewhere in the darkness, waiting for their next opportunity. The rest of the night passed in a haze of exhaustion and hypervigilance. Every sound made me jump. Every time I glanced toward the parking lot through the windows, I half expected to see a dark truck prowling between the cars. When my shift finally ended at 7 in the morning, the sunrise had never looked more beautiful. Thomas was waiting for me in the parking lot, his leg propped awkwardly in our neighbor's pickup truck. He'd convinced Jerry Muller, who lived about a mile from us, to give him a ride to the factory so he could follow me home. Seeing his familiar face creased with worry and love finally broke through the numbness I'd been carrying all night. The drive home felt different with Jerry's headlights in my rearview mirror instead of hostile pursuers. Pine Creek Road, which had become a tunnel of terror just 8 hours earlier, was transformed by daylight into something almost normal again. Almost. I still found myself checking the intersection carefully, looking for any sign of the truck or its occupants. Our driveway had never felt more welcoming. When I finally parked next to our half-finished cabin and saw 4-year-old Christopher peering out of the kitchen window in his pajamas, the last of my composure crumbled. Thomas hobbled over on his crutches as quickly as he could manage, pulling me into his arms while I sobbed against his shoulder. "You're home," he whispered into my hair. "You're safe. You're home." But even as he held me, even as Christopher wrapped his small arms around both our legs, I knew something had changed forever. The isolation of our property, which had once felt like peaceful privacy, now felt like vulnerability. The dark country roads I'd traveled without fear for years had revealed their capacity for menace. The trust I'd carried in the basic decency of strangers had been shaken to its core. That night I didn't sleep. Every sound outside, the settling of the house, the whisper of wind through the trees, the distant call of an owl, brought me fully awake, heart pounding. Thomas moved his pillow and blanket to the floor beside our bed, his presence a comfort but also a reminder of how helpless he'd be if those men decided to pay us a visit. We installed motion sensor lights around the property the following week. I changed my route to work, taking a longer path that stayed on main roads as much as possible. I never drove to work alone again without calling someone when I arrived, and I made sure Christopher understood that if a stranger ever approached our house when I wasn't home, he should lock the doors and call 911. 30 years have passed since that night, but I still tell this story. I tell it to my sons, to my daughters-in-law, to my grandchildren when they're old enough to understand. Because somewhere out there, on dark country roads just like mine, predators still wait for the perfect victim, someone alone, someone trusting, someone who hasn't yet learned that evil can wear an ordinary face and speak with a voice that asks for help. The intersection where it happened has been improved now. Better lighting, clearer sight lines, more traffic, even at night. But I still slow down every time I pass through it, still scan the shadows for dark trucks and waiting figures. Because I learned something that November night in 2015 that I can never unlearn. Sometimes the most dangerous trap isn't hidden in the wilderness. Sometimes it's right there at the crossroads, wearing the mask of mechanical trouble and human need, waiting for someone kind enough to stop and help. Trust your instincts. Lock your doors. And if something feels wrong, even if you can't put your finger on exactly what, don't ignore that feeling. It might be the only thing standing between you and becoming someone else's story, someone else's cautionary tale, whispered in the darkness of a long night shift. I was 7 years old when my parents took me along on what they called their second honeymoon to Tennessee. It was the summer of 2005, and the heat hung thick and oppressive over the Smoky Mountains like a wool blanket soaked in humidity. My mother had insisted on bringing me despite my father's protests that a romantic getaway wasn't meant for children. But Mom had won, as she always did, with her gentle smile and the way she'd tilt her head when she wanted something. The cabin we rented sat perched on a hillside overlooking Norris Lake, its weathered wood siding dark with age and moisture. It belonged to a local man named Byron Hutchins, a grizzled old-timer with tobacco-stained teeth who'd given us the keys with hands that trembled slightly. He'd warned us about the area being old land that had belonged to Cherokee tribes long before white settlers arrived. His watery blue eyes had lingered on me when he said it, and something in his expression made my stomach feel funny. The cabin itself felt wrong from the moment we stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under our feet with sounds that seemed too loud, too deliberate, as if the house was announcing our presence to something waiting in the shadows. The walls were lined with old photographs of previous guests, their faces faded and indistinct in the dim light that filtered through dirty windows. Some of the photos seemed to watch us as we moved through the rooms, and I found myself avoiding their gaze. My parents busied themselves unpacking and planning their romantic dinners and lake activities, but I felt drawn to the windows that faced the dense forest beyond the cabin's small clearing. The trees pressed close to the structure, their branches scraping against the roof when the wind picked up. Pine, oak, and maple created such a thick canopy that even in the middle of the day the forest floor remained shrouded in perpetual twilight. That first night I lay awake in the small loft bedroom listening to sounds I couldn't identify. There were the normal night sounds. Owls, crickets, the distant splash of fish jumping in the lake. But underneath those familiar noises was something else. A rhythmic scratching that seemed to come from just outside my window, followed by what sounded like footsteps circling the cabin. When I finally worked up the courage to peer out through the thin curtains, I saw nothing but darkness so complete it seemed solid. The next morning brought no relief. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to have settled into my bones, making me jumpy and irritable. Mom attributed it to excitement and new surroundings, but I knew it was something more. The forest called to me with an intensity that felt almost physical, like invisible hands tugging at my shirt, urging me to explore its depths. Dad announced over breakfast that he planned to spend the day preparing his fishing boat down at the dock. It was an old aluminum vessel that came with the cabin rental, and he was eager to test the lake's bass population. Mom decided to stay behind and read on the deck, leaving me with explicit instructions not to wander off alone. But even as she spoke the words, I felt my eyes drifting toward the tree line, where shadows seemed to shift and move independently of the wind. The dock sat at the end of a narrow dirt path that wound down from the cabin through a grove of ancient oaks. Their trunks were massive, easily 4 feet across, with bark so deeply grooved it looked like the face of some sleeping giant. Moss hung from their branches in long trailing curtains that swayed gently in the humid air. The path itself was treacherous, rutted with exposed roots and loose stones that threatened to send an unwary walker tumbling down the steep slope to the water's edge. Dad had been working on the boat for maybe 20 minutes when I saw it. The deer emerged from the forest like a ghost materializing from shadow, stepping delicately through the underbrush with an odd, measured gait. It was larger than any deer I'd ever seen, its antlers spreading wide and magnificent above its head. But something about its movement was wrong, too deliberate, too purposeful, as if it was performing rather than simply existing. It stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned to look directly at me. Not in the skittish, alert way deer normally observe potential threats. but with a steady, calculating stare that made my skin crawl. Its head tilted slightly to one side, almost like a dog listening for a familiar sound, and I felt the strangest sensation that it was trying to communicate something. Without thinking, I took a step toward it. The deer didn't bolt as I expected. Instead, it took a step backward, maintaining the distance between us while somehow encouraging me to follow. It repeated this movement several times, leading me away from the dock and my father's focused work on the outboard motor. Each step took us further from safety, deeper into the pressing embrace of the Tennessee wilderness. The deer moved with an almost hypnotic quality, pausing frequently to ensure I was still following. Its coat was a rich brown color, but in the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves, patches of it seemed to shift and change, taking on hues that didn't belong in nature. Sometimes it looked almost gray, other times a sickly yellow that reminded me of old bones. As we moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of civilization faded entirely. Dad's muttered curses at the stubborn motor, the distant hum of traffic from the main road. Even the normal bird songs seemed to be absorbed by the thick vegetation around us. The silence that replaced them was profound and unsettling, broken only by the soft crack of twigs under my sneakers, and the deer's nearly silent footfalls ahead of me. The trees grew denser, their canopy so thick that the temperature dropped noticeably. Sweat that had been beading on my forehead in the humid air suddenly felt cold and clammy. The deer led me down a winding game trail that seemed to burrow deeper into the heart of the woods, where twisted vines hung like rope and the air smelled of decay and rich earth. I should have been afraid. Some instinctual part of my 7-year-old brain was screaming warnings, but the deer's presence was strangely comforting. It would stop periodically and look back at me with what seemed like concern, making sure I hadn't fallen too far behind. Once, when I stumbled over a hidden root and scraped my knee on a jagged stone, it actually waited for me to catch up before continuing on. But as we ventured further into the wilderness, that comfort began to transform into something else entirely. The deer's behavior, which had initially seemed caring and protective, started to feel more like predatory patience. It was leading me somewhere specific, and with each step I became more certain that wherever we were going, I wouldn't want to be there. The clearing we eventually reached felt like stepping into another world entirely. It was perfectly circular, perhaps 30 feet across, ringed by towering pine trees whose branches intertwined overhead to form a natural cathedral. No sunlight penetrated this canopy, yet the space wasn't dark. Instead, it was filled with a strange greenish twilight that seemed to emanate from the moss-covered ground itself. The deer stood in the center of this clearing, no longer the graceful creature that had led me here. Now facing me directly for the first time, I could see what had been hidden in profile during our journey through the woods. Its eyes were wrong, completely, fundamentally wrong, in a way that made my stomach clench with terror. They were too large for a deer's face, and they reflected light in a way that animal eyes shouldn't. But worse than their size or luminosity was their expression. These weren't the dark, liquid eyes of a wild animal. They held intelligence, human intelligence, and something else that I couldn't identify but that made every nerve in my body scream danger. The irises were a deep, blood-red color that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. As I stared, transfixed by horror and fascination, I realized that rhythm matched my own rapid heartbeat. The pupils were wrong too, not the horizontal slits of a deer, or even the round pupils of a human, but something in between that created an unsettling optical illusion. Looking into them was like staring into deep water where something large and hungry circled just beyond sight. But the intelligence behind those eyes was the most disturbing aspect of all. They studied me with the calculating assessment of a predator sizing up prey, but also with something that felt almost like recognition, as if this creature, whatever it was, had been waiting for me specifically, as if our encounter in these woods had been planned and orchestrated rather than the random result of a curious child following an animal into the forest. I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and flee back down the path we'd followed, to crash through the underbrush and vines until I reached the safety of the lake and my father's presence. But those eyes held me frozen in place as surely as if I'd been bound with rope. They promised terrible things would happen if I tried to leave, and somehow I believed that promise completely. The deer took a step closer, its movement now clearly different from the natural gait I'd observed earlier. There was something almost human in the way it placed its hooves, a deliberate precision that no wild animal possessed. Each step was calculated and purposeful, designed to close the distance between us while giving me time to fully appreciate what was happening. Its head tilted again, that same dog-like gesture I'd noticed at the edge of the clearing near the dock. But now, up close, I could see it wasn't curiosity or confusion driving the movement. The creature was listening, but not to sounds from the forest around us. It was listening to something else entirely, something I couldn't hear but that seemed to be giving it instructions. The red eyes never left mine as it approached, and I became aware of other wrongness about this animal. Its breathing was too quiet for something its size, as if its lungs worked differently than they should. Its coat, which had seemed merely unusual in the shifting forest light, now revealed patterns that hurt to look at directly, swirls and designs that seemed to move and change when I wasn't focusing on them completely. But it was the eyes that held my attention. Those impossible red orbs that seemed to see not just my physical form but something deeper. They looked into me with the intensity of someone reading a book, turning pages of my thoughts and memories with casual violation. I felt exposed and vulnerable in a way that went far beyond simple fear of a wild animal. When the deer was close enough that I could smell its breath, a sick, sweet odor like rotting flowers, it stopped moving and simply stared at me with those terrible, knowing eyes. We stood there in the strange twilight of the clearing, predator and prey locked in a moment that stretched impossibly long. And in that stretched moment I began to notice other details that filled me with growing dread. As my eyes adjusted to the unnatural light of the clearing, I began to make out details that my mind initially refused to process. The deer's neck showed a clear line of demarcation, as if its head had been removed and reattached. The line ran completely around its throat, marked by what looked unmistakably like surgical stitches. These weren't the neat, precise sutures a veterinarian might use, but crude, uneven work done with thick, dark thread that had turned an ugly brown color. Some of the stitches had pulled loose, leaving gaps where the underlying tissue showed through, tissue that looked wrong, too pale and waxy to belong to a living animal. The entire seam wept a clear fluid that caught the strange light and gleamed like tears. The wrongness of it made me physically ill. My stomach lurched, and I tasted bile in the back of my throat. This wasn't a natural animal. It was something that had been assembled, pieced together from parts that hadn't originally belonged to the same creature. The head sat slightly askew on the neck, tilted at an angle that would have been impossible for a living deer to maintain comfortably. As I stared in horrified fascination, the creature seemed to sense my discovery. Its lips pulled back in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth that definitely didn't belong in a deer's mouth. They were square and flat, like human molars, but far too many of them. Row upon row of white, perfectly straight human teeth that gleamed wetly in the dim light. Some appeared to have been filed to sharp points, creating a grotesque parody of a carnivore's mouth in what should have been an herbivore's face. The stitched seam around its neck began to weep more freely, the clear fluid now tinged with something darker that trickled down into the creature's coat. The smell that emanated from it grew stronger too, that sick, sweet scent of decay that I'd noticed before, now mixed with the sharp, metallic odor of fresh blood and something else I couldn't identify but that made my eyes water. The deer, or whatever this thing pretending to be a deer actually was, began to circle me with slow, deliberate steps. Its hooves made soft clicking sounds against the moss-covered ground, but underneath those sounds I could hear something else, a wet, sliding noise that seemed to come from the loosely attached head as it swayed with each step. The stitches were failing, and with each movement the head shifted more dramatically on the neck. I wanted to close my eyes, to shut out the impossible sight in front of me, but I was terrified of what might happen if I couldn't see what it was doing. The red orbs never left my face as it completed its circuit around me, studying me from every angle like a sculptor examining a block of marble before beginning to carve. When it completed its circle and stood facing me again, I noticed that the stitches weren't the only evidence of surgical intervention. Its legs showed similar marks, faint lines where different pieces had been joined together. The coat pattern didn't match at these junction points, as if parts from multiple animals had been combined to create this single horrifying whole. The creature's breathing became more pronounced, each inhalation and exhalation accompanied by a wet, bubbling sound that seemed to come from the damaged throat beneath those crude stitches. Foam appeared at the corners of its mouth, mixed with strands of that dark fluid that continued to leak from the neck wound. The sight was so disturbing that my legs began to shake and I worried I might collapse from sheer terror. But the worst part was the intelligence behind those red eyes. This wasn't some mindless monster or animal driven by instinct. Whatever was looking out at me from behind that deer's face was calculating, patient, and utterly malevolent. It was enjoying my fear, feeding on my horror like a connoisseur savoring a fine wine. The head tilted again, more dramatically this time, and I heard the wet sound of tissue tearing as some of the remaining stitches gave way under the strain. A wider gap opened in the seam, revealing darkness underneath that seemed to go far deeper than any animal's throat should. From that darkness came a new smell, something ancient and putrid that made the previous odors seem pleasant by comparison. The silence of the clearing was broken by something far worse than any animal sound I'd ever heard. It started as a low rumbling that seemed to come from deep within the creature's chest, then rose to become something that might have been an attempt at human speech. But the voice that emerged was wrong in every possible way. Too deep, too wet, formed by vocal cords that clearly weren't designed for making words. Why did you follow? Each word came out as a separate, labored effort, punctuated by that horrible bubbling sound from its damaged throat. The voice had an odd, echoing quality as if it was being produced by multiple sources simultaneously. Some words seemed to come from the mouth with its rows of human teeth, while others appeared to originate from deeper within the creature, from the dark spaces visible through the failing stitches. I couldn't answer. Terror had stolen my voice completely, leaving me standing there with my mouth open, producing only a thin, whimpering sound that I didn't recognize as coming from myself. My entire body was shaking now, violent tremors that I couldn't control. The rational part of my 7-year-old mind kept insisting that animals couldn't talk, that this had to be some kind of dream or hallucination, but the evidence of my senses was overwhelming. Answer me, child. The words came more easily now, as if the creature was remembering how human speech worked. But there was still that underlying wrongness, that sense that each syllable was being forced through anatomy that hadn't been designed for language. Wet, clicking sounds accompanied each consonant, and the vowels were distorted by what sounded like fluid in the throat. I tried to speak, tried to tell it I was sorry, that I hadn't meant to intrude, that I just wanted to go back to my father, but only strangled gasps emerged from my throat. The creature seemed to find my inability to respond amusing, and that horrible parody of a smile widened, revealing more of those perfectly human teeth arranged in utterly inhuman rows. Afraid? It asked, and this time there was something almost like laughter in its voice. Good? You should be. The head tilted so far to one side that I could hear more stitches popping, see the dark fluid flowing more freely from the widening gap. I have been waiting for you. Those words hit me like a physical blow. Waiting for me. How could it have been waiting for me when I'd only decided to follow it on impulse? Unless this hadn't been the random encounter I'd thought it was. The idea that this creature had somehow planned our meeting, had perhaps been watching me since we'd arrived at the cabin, filled me with a terror so profound that my vision began to blur at the edges. Your parents think they know this place. Each word was clearer than the last, as if the creature was gaining confidence in its ability to communicate. But this land remembers what came before. It took a step closer, and I could see my own reflection in those terrible red eyes, a small, terrified child who looked far younger than his 7 years. The creature's next words came in a rush, as if it had been holding them back and finally decided to release them. I remember too. I remember when your kind first came here, burning and killing and taking what wasn't theirs. I remember the promises that were broken and the blood that was spilled on ground that was sacred. Its voice was changing as it spoke, becoming less labored, more fluent, but also somehow less human despite the improved articulation. There was an accent now, something I couldn't place but that sounded old, older than anything I'd ever heard. The words themselves began to take on a rhythmic quality, almost like chanting, and the red eyes seemed to pulse in time with the cadence. Your people took our bodies and our land, but they couldn't take what we became after death. We learned new ways to hunt, new ways to wear the shapes that would let us walk among you unnoticed. The creature circled me again as it spoke, its hooves now making no sound at all on the moss-covered ground. We learned patience. We learned to wait for the right moment, the right victim, the right opportunity for revenge. I finally found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Please, I want to go home. The words seemed pathetically inadequate in the face of the creature's revelation, but they were all I could manage. The deer thing stopped directly in front of me, close enough now that I could feel heat radiating from its body, heat that was all wrong for a living animal. too intense and carrying with it that sick, sweet smell of corruption. "Home?" it repeated, and now its voice held something that might have been pity. "This is your home now, child. This clearing, this moment, this terror, this is where you belong." The spell was broken by the sound of my father's voice echoing through the forest, distant but getting closer. He was calling my name with increasing urgency, and I could hear branches snapping as he crashed through the underbrush, following the path I'd taken into the woods. The creature heard it too, its malformed head swiveling toward the sound with an expression that combined annoyance and something that looked almost like disappointment. "Go," it said, but the word came out more like a hiss, the human voice slipping back toward something more animal. "But know that I will find you again. Distance means nothing to what I am. Time means nothing. This is not over between us." The red eyes fixed on mine one final time, and in them I saw a promise that chilled me to my core. This creature, whatever it was, had marked me in some way. Our encounter had created a connection that wouldn't be broken simply by physical separation. I would carry this moment with me forever, and it would carry the memory of me. As my father's voice grew closer, the deer thing began to back away from me, moving toward the ring of trees that surrounded the clearing, but it didn't run like a normal animal would. Instead, it maintained eye contact as long as possible, only turning away at the last moment before disappearing into the shadows between the pine trunks. Even after I could no longer see it, I felt those red orbs watching me from the darkness. I stood alone in the clearing for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, my body still shaking from the encounter. The strange twilight that had illuminated the space began to fade, returning to normal forest darkness that should have been more frightening than the supernatural glow, but somehow felt safer. The oppressive atmosphere that had marked the creature's presence lifted gradually, like fog dissipating in morning sunlight. When Dad finally burst through the trees, his face was flushed with exertion and worry. He took one look at my tear-streaked face and immediately gathered me into his arms, checking me for injuries while demanding to know what had happened. I tried to tell him about the deer, about its red eyes and stitched neck and the words it had spoken, but the story sounded insane even to my own ears. He listened with the patience of a parent dealing with a child's nightmare, nodding and making appropriate sounds while clearly not believing a word I said. When I described the human teeth and the creature's ability to speak, his expression shifted from concern to something that looked almost like relief. Obviously, his son had wandered off and gotten scared, then invented a fantastic story to explain his terror. It was normal childhood behavior, nothing more sinister than an overactive imagination. "Let's get you back to the cabin," he said, lifting me easily and carrying me out of the clearing. "Your mother is worried sick and you need some food and rest. This forest can play tricks on a person's mind, especially a young person who's not used to being in such wild places." As we left the clearing, I looked back over Dad's shoulder, hoping to see nothing but trees and shadows. Instead, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the woods, something large and brown that seemed to be keeping pace with us as we made our way back toward the lake. When I pointed it out to my father, he looked but saw nothing, which only reinforced his belief that stress and imagination were responsible for my claims. The walk back to the cabin felt endless. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every rustle of leaves suggested something large moving just out of sight. Dad kept up a steady stream of conversation, trying to distract me from my fear, but I could barely focus on his words. All my attention was fixed on the forest around us, searching for signs of the creature's presence. When we finally reached the safety of the dock, I felt some of the tension leave my body, but it was far from gone entirely. The encounter in the clearing had changed something fundamental in me. The world no longer felt like a safe place where parents could protect their children from harm. There were things in the darkness that meant us ill, things that had intelligence and patience and reasons for hatred that went back generations. Mom was waiting for us on the deck, her face drawn with worry that transformed into relief when she saw us emerging from the forest. She rushed down to meet us, enveloping me in a hug that smelled like sunscreen and the lavender soap she always used. Her familiar presence was comforting, but even in her arms I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched from the trees. That evening passed in a blur of concerned parental attention and half-hearted attempts to return to vacation normalcy. Mom made my favorite dinner, grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, while Dad regaled us with stories of the fish he'd almost caught while I'd been gone. But despite their efforts, the atmosphere in the cabin remained tense. I jumped at every sound, refused to go anywhere near the windows that faced the forest, and insisted on keeping all the lights on even after sunset. My parents attributed my behavior to the shock of getting lost in unfamiliar woods, and I let them believe it. The alternative, trying to convince them that I'd encountered some kind of shape-shifting creature that could speak and had threatened me, seemed hopeless. Adults had their own logic about what was possible and what wasn't, and children's stories about talking animals fell firmly into the not possible category. But as the evening wore on, my hypervigilance began to seem more justified. Small sounds from outside the cabin, sounds that would normally have been dismissed as wildlife or wind, took on sinister significance. The scratching I'd heard the night before returned, more pronounced and definitely deliberate. Something was circling the cabin, testing the windows and doors, looking for a way in. Around 10 o'clock, as my parents were settling down in the main room with glasses of wine and a deck of cards, I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. From somewhere outside came a sound that started as an animal's call, but shifted midway through into something that resembled a human voice calling my name. It was distorted and wrong, but unmistakably an attempt to mimic human speech. My parents didn't seem to hear it, or if they did, they showed no recognition that it was anything unusual. Dad continued shuffling the cards while Mom sorted through a magazine. Both of them relaxed in a way that seemed impossible given what was happening just outside their awareness. I wanted to point out the sound, to demand they listen more carefully, but something held me back. Some instinct warned me that drawing their attention to the creature's presence might provoke it into more direct action. The calling continued sporadically throughout the evening, always just barely audible enough that I could convince myself I might have imagined it. But I knew I hadn't. The thing from the clearing was out there in the darkness, letting me know it hadn't forgotten our encounter. It was patient, willing to wait for the right moment, but it was definitely still there. When my parents finally decided it was time for bed, I begged them to let me sleep in their room. They refused, gently but firmly, insisting that I needed to face my fears and that nothing in the Tennessee woods could hurt me as long as I was safe inside the cabin. They tucked me into the loft bed, kissed me goodnight, and turned off the lights with the casual confidence of adults who believed they understood the nature of danger. I lay in the darkness for what felt like hours, listening to the sounds of the forest outside, and trying to distinguish between normal night noises and the presence of something that definitely wasn't normal. Several times I heard that wet, bubbling breathing I'd noticed in the clearing, always from just outside my window, always accompanied by a soft scratching as if something was testing the strength of the glass. It was around midnight, when the most terrifying event of the entire ordeal occurred. I had finally started to drift off to sleep when a sound jolted me fully awake. The unmistakable creak of the cabin's front door opening. My parents were deep sleepers, especially after wine, and neither of them stirred as footsteps moved across the wooden floor below my loft. The steps were wrong, too heavy for my mother, too irregular for my father. They had an odd limping quality that suggested the walker was having difficulty with balance or coordination. Worse still, they were wet, leaving what sounded like puddles with each footfall. The sick, sweet smell I'd noticed in the clearing began to fill the cabin, growing stronger as whatever was making those sounds moved through the rooms below. I pressed myself flat against the bed, trying to become invisible while simultaneously straining to hear what was happening downstairs. The footsteps paused at the base of the ladder that led to my loft, and I held my breath, certain that at any moment I would see that horrible deer head with its red eyes and stitched neck appearing at the top of the stairs. Instead, I heard a voice, the same wet, bubbling voice from the clearing, but clearer now, more practiced at human speech. It wasn't speaking to me, though. It seemed to be talking to itself, or perhaps to something else I couldn't see, in a language I didn't recognize, but that sounded ancient and full of pain. The monologue continued for several minutes, rising and falling in volume and intensity. Sometimes it sounded like pleading, other times like anger or frustration. Through it all, those wet footsteps continued moving around the cabin's main floor, and I caught glimpses of a shadow on the wall that didn't match the shape of any animal I knew. It was tall bipedal, but wrong in proportions that hurt to look at even in silhouette. Finally, the voice fell silent, and the footsteps moved back toward the front door. I heard it open and close again, and gradually the oppressive atmosphere began to lift. But the smell lingered, and when I finally worked up the courage to look out my window, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. Even in the darkness I could make out its basic shape. Humanoid but wrong, too tall and angular. with what looked like antlers or branches protruding from its head. It stood there for the rest of the night, watching the cabin with patience that seemed superhuman. Every time I checked the window, it was in exactly the same position, as motionless as a statue. Only when the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky did it finally turn and disappear back into the depths of the forest. I'm 25 now, and 18 years have passed since that nightmare in the Tennessee woods. The intervening years have been marked by therapy, medication for anxiety and panic attacks, and a carefully constructed life that keeps me as far from wilderness areas as possible. I live in downtown Chicago, surrounded by concrete and steel and the comforting presence of millions of other people. I work in tech support, a job that keeps me indoors and connected to the rational digital world where monsters don't exist and deer don't speak with human voices. But the creature's promise has proven true. Distance has meant nothing. Time has meant nothing. The connection forged in that clearing when I was 7 years old has never been broken, and I've learned that some experiences leave marks on the soul that can never be erased or explained away. The panic attacks started when I was 12 and saw a deer while on a family camping trip to Wisconsin. The animal was completely normal, brown coat, dark eyes, natural proportions, but the sight of it sent me into a spiral of terror so intense that my parents had to drive me to the nearest emergency room. The doctor diagnosed anxiety and recommended counseling, which helped somewhat but couldn't address the core issue. I knew, with absolute certainty, that what I'd encountered in Tennessee hadn't been a normal animal, and I knew it was still out there. Over the years, the encounters have continued. Never as direct or terrifying as that first meeting, but constant reminders that I'm being watched and remembered. I'll be walking down a busy Chicago street and catch a glimpse of red eyes in my peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing there. Sometimes I hear that wet, bubbling breathing in quiet moments, late at night in my apartment, during long elevator rides, in the silence between songs on my headphones. The creature has learned subtlety over the years, adapting its approach to my adult life in ways that a child's mind couldn't have imagined. It appears in reflections that don't quite match my surroundings, in shadows that fall at impossible angles, in dreams that feel more like visitations than products of my subconscious. Always watching, always waiting, always reminding me that our business isn't finished. I've researched the area where we stayed that summer, using resources that weren't available to my 7-year-old self. The land does have a dark history. Forced relocations of Cherokee tribes, broken treaties, violence and betrayal, dating back generations. Byron Hutchins, the man who rented us the cabin, disappeared 3 years after our visit. His body was never found, though hunters did discover pieces of his clothing scattered through the same forest where I'd had my encounter. The Cherokee have legends about creatures called bone walkers, spirits of the dead who could inhabit the bodies of animals to seek revenge against those who'd wronged them. These beings were said to be immortal, patient, and utterly implacable in their pursuit of justice. They could wear any shape they chose, but their eyes always remained the same, red as fresh blood and filled with the intelligence of humans who had died in great pain and anger. I've never returned to Tennessee, and I never will. But I know now that it doesn't matter where I go or how far I run. The thing in the woods has claimed me as its own, marked me in ways I'm only beginning to understand. Each year that passes, the encounters become more frequent, more intense, more personal. It's no longer content to simply watch and wait. It's preparing for something, building towards some final confrontation that I can sense approaching like a storm on the horizon. Sometimes, in the darkest moments of sleepless nights, I wonder if I'm going insane. If the stress of that childhood encounter has broken something in my mind that can never be repaired. But then I smell that sick, sweet odor of decay, or catch a reflection of red eyes in a storefront window, and I know the truth. The creature is real, it's still hunting me, and eventually, probably sooner than I want to believe, it's going to finish what it started in that clearing all those years ago. The only question that remains is whether I'll have the strength to face it when that moment comes, or if I'll die as terrified and helpless as the 7-year-old boy who followed a deer into the Tennessee woods and discovered that some nightmares never end. All I know for certain is that my parents were wrong when they promised nothing in those woods could hurt me. Something could. Something did. And something still does. God help me, but I think my time is almost up. The warm glow of the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. As I, Jake Thompson, sat on my porch scrolling through my phone, It was a Friday evening in early October, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant bonfires. I had just finished a long week at the local high school where I taught history, and I was looking forward to a relaxing weekend. As I mindlessly scrolled through my social media feed, a news article caught my eye. Experienced hiker vanishes without a trace in Huckleberry Swamp Nature Area. The headline sent a chill down my spine. Despite the lingering warmth of the day, Huckleberry Swamp was less than an hour's drive from my home in Hartford, Connecticut, and I had hiked there numerous times over the years. Curiosity piqued, I tapped on the article and began to read. The missing hiker, identified as 42-year-old Martin Greaves, had last been seen entering the nature area 2 weeks ago. Despite extensive search efforts by local authorities and volunteers, no trace of him had been found. The article mentioned that Greaves was an experienced outdoorsman who had hiked challenging trails all over the country. As I continued reading, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from my friend Marcella Quinn, a vivacious 28-year-old librarian I had met at a local book club a few years back. "Hey Jake, Tyrese and I were thinking about doing a night hike tomorrow. You in?" I hesitated for a moment, my eyes darting back to the article about the missing hiker. A part of me wanted to mention it to Marcella, but another part dismissed the thought. After all, people went missing in the wilderness all the time, right? It was probably just a coincidence that it happened so close to home. Before I could overthink it, I typed out a reply. "Sounds fun. Where were you thinking of going?" Marcella's response came quickly. "We were thinking Huckleberry Swamp. Tyrese says it's beautiful at night, and the forecast looks clear. Meet at my place around." I felt a twinge of unease as I read her message. Huckleberry Swamp. The very place where that hiker had disappeared. I contemplated backing out, but the rational part of my brain kicked in. The swamp was a large area, and the chances of anything happening to us were slim to none. Plus, we'd be in a group, not hiking alone like the missing man. "Count me in," I replied, pushing aside my lingering doubts. "See you tomorrow at 8. As I set my phone down and gazed out at the darkening sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just made a decision that would change my life forever. Little did I know how right that premonition would turn out to be. The next day passed in a blur of mundane activities. I graded papers, did some laundry, and even managed to squeeze in a quick workout at the local gym. As evening approached, I began to pack my backpack for the night hike. Flashlight? Check. Extra batteries? Check. Water bottle? Check. I methodically went through my mental checklist, ensuring I had everything I might need for a few hours in the woods. As I zipped up my pack, my eyes fell on the local newspaper sitting on my kitchen counter. The headline about the missing hiker stared back at me, seeming to mock my decision to go on this hike. I shook my head, trying to dispel the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at me all day. "It's just a hike, Jake," I muttered to myself. "Nothing to worry about." At precisely 7:45 p.m., I locked up my apartment and headed to my car. The drive to Marcella's place was short, and before I knew it, I was pulling up in front of her modest bungalow. Tyrese's beat-up pickup truck was already parked in the driveway. As I approached the front door, I could hear laughter coming from inside. I knocked, and moments later, Marcella swung the door open, her face lit up with a bright smile. "Jake, you made it," she exclaimed, pulling me into a quick hug. "Come on in, we're just about ready to head out." I stepped inside, immediately enveloped by the warm, inviting atmosphere of Marcella's home. Tyrese Hillman, our other hiking companion for the night, was lounging on the couch, his tall, athletic frame barely fitting on the small piece of furniture. "Hey man," Tyrese greeted me with a nod and a fist bump. "Ready for some night hiking?" I nodded, trying to match his enthusiasm. "As ready as I'll ever be." Marcella bustled around the living room, double-checking her own backpack. At 28, she was the youngest of our trio, but often the most organized and prepared. Her curly brown hair was pulled back into a practical ponytail, and her green eyes sparkled with excitement. "So, what made you guys decide on a night hike?" I asked, curiosity getting the better of me. Tyrese grinned, his white teeth contrasting sharply with his dark skin. "Man, you haven't lived until you've experienced the swamp at night. The sounds, the smells, it's a whole different world." Marcella nodded in agreement. "Plus, there's supposed to be a meteor shower tonight. I thought it might be cool to watch it from the observation deck in the nature area." Their enthusiasm was infectious, and I felt my earlier apprehensions start to fade. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. As we made our final preparations, I debated whether or not to mention the article about the missing hiker. In the end, I decided against it. Why spoil the mood with unnecessary worry? "All right, troops," Marcella announced, hoisting her backpack onto her shoulders. "Let's move out." We piled into Tyrese's truck, the excitement palpable as we set off towards Huckleberry Swamp Nature Area. The sun had long since set, and the world outside the truck's windows was shrouded in darkness. As we drove, Tyrese regaled us with stories from his job as a park ranger. He had a way of spinning tales that made even the most mundane encounters with wildlife sound like epic adventures. Marcella and I listened, laughing at his animated descriptions and terrible animal impressions. Before long, we were pulling into the deserted parking lot of the nature area. As we climbed out of the truck, the silence of the night seemed to engulf us. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel under our boots and the distant hoot of an owl. Tyrese led the way to the trailhead, his powerful flashlight cutting through the darkness. Marcella fell in step beside him, while I brought up the rear. As we passed the information board at the start of the trail, I couldn't help but notice a missing person flyer with Martin Greaves' face staring back at me. A shiver ran down my spine and I quickened my pace to catch up with my friends. As we plunged into the dense forest, the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers in the beam of our flashlights. Little did we know that with each step, we were walking deeper into a nightmare that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. The Huckleberry Swamp Nature Area was a different place at night. During the day, it was a serene woodland, filled with the cheerful songs of birds and the rustle of small animals. But as we ventured deeper into the forest under the cover of darkness, it felt as if we had stepped into another world entirely. Our flashlights carved narrow paths through the inky blackness, illuminating twisted tree trunks and gnarled roots that seemed to reach out to trip us. The canopy above was so thick that it blocked out most of the starlight, leaving us in an almost oppressive darkness beyond the reach of our artificial light. Tyrese led the way, his confident strides betraying his familiarity with the terrain. As a park ranger, he had walked these trails countless times, but even he seemed more cautious than usual in the all-encompassing night. "Watch your step here," he called back to us, his deep voice barely above a whisper. "The trail gets a bit tricky." I glanced down, noticing how the packed dirt of the trail gave way to loose, shifting soil. The ground beneath our feet was becoming softer, spongier, a sign that we were approaching the swampy areas that gave this place its name. Marcella walked between us, her usual chatter subdued by the eerie atmosphere. Every so often she would startle at a sudden sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, her flashlight beam darting wildly to investigate. "You okay?" I asked her softly, noticing the tension in her shoulders. She nodded, offering a weak smile. "Yeah, just a bit jumpy. It's so different here at night." I understood exactly what she meant. There was something primal about being in the woods after dark, something that stirred ancient fears buried deep in our collective subconscious. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, every sound a possible danger. As we continued our hike, the trail began to wind its way deeper into the swamp. The air grew thick and heavy with moisture, carrying the pungent scent of decaying vegetation. Our boots sank slightly with each step, the soft ground threatening to swallow us whole if we lingered too long in one spot. Tyrese paused at a fork in the trail, consulting a map he'd pulled from his pocket. "If we take the left path, it'll lead us to the observation deck," he said. "Should be a good spot to watch for those meteors." We nodded in agreement and followed him down the left-hand trail. This path was narrower, less well-maintained than the main trail we'd been on. Branches reached out from the darkness, snagging our clothes and scratching at exposed skin. As we pushed forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every few steps I found myself glancing over my shoulder, searching the darkness for what? I wasn't sure. But the sensation of unseen eyes boring into me was impossible to ignore. Suddenly, Marcella let out a startled gasp. "Did you guys see that?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Tyrese and I both swung our flashlights in the direction she was pointing, but saw nothing but trees and undergrowth. "See what?" Tyrese asked, his tone a mixture of concern and skepticism. Marcella shook her head, her eyes wide. I'm not sure. I thought I saw something move, just at the edge of the light, like a shadow. But wrong somehow. I felt a chill run down my spine at her words. Wrong how? She struggled to find the right words. It was too tall, too thin. Not like a person or an animal. Just wrong. Tyrese chuckled, but it sounded forced. Probably just a branch moving in the wind. This place can play tricks on your eyes at night. But there was no wind, I realized. The air around us was completely still, almost stagnant. We pressed on, but the atmosphere had changed. The excitement of our night hike had been replaced by a growing sense of unease. Even Tyrese, usually so laid back and confident, seemed on edge, his eyes darting from side to side as he led us forward. The trail began to slope upward, and I knew we must be nearing the observation deck. Just a little further, I told myself. We'll watch the meteor shower, and then we can head back. Everything will be fine. But as we crested the hill and the observation deck came into view, silhouetted against the starry sky, an unmistakable crack of a branch echoed through the night. It was close, too close, and far too loud to be caused by any small animal. We all froze, our flashlights scanning the surrounding forest. My heart pounded fiercely as I strained my eyes to penetrate the dense foliage. The moon, which had been providing at least some ambient light, chose that moment to hide behind a bank of thick clouds, plunging the forest into even deeper darkness. Marcella, Tyrese, and I shared uneasy glances. In that moment, I couldn't help but think of the missing hiker. Had he heard a similar sound before he disappeared? Had he felt this same fear coursing through his veins? As we stood there, frozen in indecision, I realized that our simple night hike had turned into something far more sinister. Whatever was out there in the darkness, whatever had made that sound, it was clear that we were no longer alone in the Huckleberry Swamp. The silence that followed the loud crack was almost worse than the sound itself. It stretched on, taut as a bowstring, while we stood rooted to the spot, barely daring to breathe. Our flashlight beams danced erratically across the trees, searching for any sign of movement, any clue as to what had made that noise. Tyrese was the first to break the silence. "Okay," he whispered, his usual bravado noticeably absent. "Let's not panic, it was probably just a deer or something." But the look in his eyes betrayed his words. Whatever had snapped that branch was no deer. We all knew it instinctively. "Maybe we should head back," Marcella suggested, her voice barely audible. Her face was pale in the harsh glare of the flashlights, eyes wide with fear. I nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I think that's a good idea. We can always come back another night for the meteor shower." Tyrese hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between his role as our guide and his own growing unease. Finally, he nodded. "All right, let's head back. Stay close together." We turned away from the observation deck, our earlier goal forgotten in the face of this new, unseen threat. Tyrese took the lead again, but his pace was quicker now, more urgent. Marcella fell in behind him, with me bringing up the rear. As we retraced our steps down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded. Each snap of a twig, each rustle of leaves seemed to come from behind us or to our sides, as if something was corralling us along the path. The forest around us had taken on a malevolent air. The trees, which had seemed merely spooky before, now felt actively hostile. Their branches reached out like claws, snagging our clothes and scratching our skin. Roots seemed to rise up from the ground, threatening to trip us with each step. We had been walking for about 10 minutes when Tyrese suddenly stopped short, causing Marcella to bump into him. "Wait," he hissed, holding up a hand for silence. We froze, straining our ears. At first I heard nothing but the pounding of my own heart. Then, faintly but unmistakably, I picked up the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, splashing through shallow water. "Who's there?" Marcella called out, her voice louder than she probably intended, cracking slightly with fear. The footsteps ceased for a moment, and in that silence I swear I could hear the sound of heavy breathing. Not our own, but something else, something bigger. Then the footsteps resumed, more purposeful now, heading directly towards us. "Run!" Tyrese yelled, all pretense of calm abandoned. We took off down the trail, no longer caring about stealth or silence. Branches whipped at our faces as we ran. Roots threatened to trip us at every step. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly, creating a disorienting strobe effect that made it even harder to see where I was going. Behind us, I could hear our pursuer crashing through the underbrush. Whatever it was big, and it was fast. The sound of its pursuit spurred us on, driving us to run faster than I thought possible. Suddenly, Marcella cried out in pain. I turned to see her sprawled on the ground, clutching her ankle. She must have tripped over a root in our mad dash. Tyrese and I skidded to a stop, rushing back to help her. As I reached down to help Marcella up, my flashlight beam caught something that made my blood run cold. Just inches from where she had fallen lay a weathered shoe, caked with mud, and partially hidden by leaves. Next to it were scraps of torn fabric, dark stains marring the tattered cloth. "Oh God," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of our heavy breathing. Tyrese followed my gaze, his eyes widening as he took in the grisly scene. "We need to move," he said urgently, already bending down to help Marcella to her feet. "Can you walk?" Marcella nodded, grimacing as she put weight on her injured ankle. "I think so, but I'll be slow." "Lean on me," I offered, draping her arm over my shoulder. "We'll go as fast as we can." As we set off again, our pace significantly reduced by Marcella's injury. I couldn't help but think about the owner of that shoe. Was it the missing hiker, Martin Greaves? And if so, what had happened to him? The torn clothing and dark stains painted a gruesome picture in my mind. Our pursuers seemed to have fallen back, but I could still hear occasional crashes in the underbrush behind us, reminding us that we were far from safe. The sounds seemed to come from multiple directions now, as if we were being surrounded. "What is that thing?" Marcella whispered, her voice tight with pain and fear. "I don't know," Tyrese replied, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness around us. "But whatever it is, it's not natural." As if to confirm his words, a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human. The sound sent shivers down my spine and seemed to reverberate in my very bones. We pressed on, every step a struggle against the treacherous terrain and our own mounting terror. The oppressive darkness seemed to close in around us, our flashlights barely piercing the gloom. Strange whispers seemed to slide through the trees, just on the edge of hearing. A sour, musky stench filled the air, growing stronger with each passing moment. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flash of movement, too quick and too strange to properly process. But the glimpse I caught was enough to turn my blood to ice. It was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen or imagined. Its body was covered in mottled fur, matted and tangled with twigs and leaves. But it was the creature's shape that defied logic. Elongated limbs that seemed capable of bending in impossible ways, ending in viciously sharp claws. And its face. God, its face. In the brief moment I saw it, I noticed eyes like swirling pools of darkness, filled with a malevolent intelligence that was unmistakably predatory. "Run," I yelled, my voice cracking with terror. "It's right there." We abandoned all pretense of stealth, crashing through the underbrush in a desperate bid for survival. Marcella whimpered in pain with each step, but adrenaline kept her moving. Tyrese took the lead, using his superior strength to forge a path through the dense vegetation. Behind us, the creature let out a bone-chilling screech and gave chase. I could hear it moving through the forest with unnatural speed and agility, far outpacing what should have been possible in such dense undergrowth. "We can't outrun it," Marcella gasped, her face pale with pain and fear. She was right. With her injured ankle slowing us down, and the creature's inhuman speed, it was only a matter of time before it caught up to us. We needed a plan, and fast. "Tyrese," I shouted between ragged breaths, "isn't there a ranger station nearby?" Tyrese's face lit up with sudden hope. "Yes, about half a mile east of here. If we can make it there, we might have a chance." With renewed determination, we changed course, heading east as best we could while navigating the treacherous swamp. Every splash of our feet in the shallow water seemed to echo in the unnaturally quiet forest. The creature's pursuit had gone silent, which was somehow even more terrifying than hearing it crash through the underbrush. As we struggled onward, I couldn't help but wonder about the nature of our pursuer. What was this thing that defied all logical explanation? Was it some kind of undiscovered species? A government experiment gone wrong? Or something even more sinister? Something that shouldn't exist in our rational scientific world? My musings were cut short as Tyrese suddenly stopped, holding up a hand for silence. For a moment, all I could hear was our labored breathing and the pounding of my own heart. Then, faintly but unmistakably, I heard voices in the distance. "The ranger station," Tyrese whispered, his voice filled with relief. "We're almost there." But our relief was short-lived. From behind us came a sound that could only be described as a roar, a sound filled with rage and hunger that shook the very air around us. The creature had realized its prey was about to escape. "Go," I yelled, pushing Marcella forward. "Run for the station." We burst from the tray line into a small clearing. In the center stood a sturdy log building, the ranger station. Light spilled from its windows, a beacon of hope in the darkness that had surrounded us. As we sprinted across the open ground, I risked a glance back. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. The creature had emerged from the forest, its true form fully visible in the moonlight that now broke through the clouds. It was even more terrifying than the glimpses I'd caught before, a nightmarish amalgamation of animal and something utterly alien. Its eyes locked onto us, filled with an intelligence and malevolence that was unmistakably otherworldly. We reached the ranger station door just as the creature let out another ear-splitting roar. Tyrese wrenched the door open, and we tumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. Two startled rangers jumped to their feet, hands instinctively moving to their sidearms. "What the hell?" one of them exclaimed. "Lock the door," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "There's something out there." The rangers looked confused, but the terror in our eyes must have convinced them of the seriousness of the situation. One of them quickly secured the door while the other moved to the radio. "This is Ranger Stevens at Huckleberry Station," he said into the mic. "We have a situation here, requesting immediate backup." As the ranger called for help, I helped Marcella to a chair, finally able to examine her injured ankle. It was swollen and starting to bruise, but thankfully didn't appear to be broken. Tyrese was at the window, peering out into the darkness. "I don't see it," he muttered. "Where did it go?" As if in answer to his question, an unearthly howl split the night, causing us all to jump. "It was close, too close." "What exactly is out there?" one of the rangers asked, his hand resting uneasily on his holstered gun. I opened my mouth to respond, but how could I possibly explain what we'd seen? How could I describe a creature that defied all logic and reason? Before I could formulate an answer, a tremendous crash shook the building. Wood splintered, and I turned just in time to see a monstrous clawed hand punching through the wall. The night was far from over, and our ordeal had only just begun. The ranger station erupted into chaos as the creature's massive clawed hand withdrew, leaving a gaping hole in the wall. Splinters of wood littered the floor, and the acrid smell of the beast's musk filled the air. "What the hell is that thing?" One of the rangers, the one who had been on the radio, shouted, his face pale with shock. "I don't know," Tyrese replied, his voice tight with fear, "but it's been chasing us through the swamp for the last hour." The other ranger, Stevens, I recalled, had drawn his sidearm and was aiming it at the hole in the wall. "Whatever it is, it's not getting in here," he declared, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Another crash rocked the building, this time from the roof. Dust and debris rained down on us as the creature's claws tore at the shingles, searching for a way in. Marcella whimpered in fear, clutching her injured ankle. I moved to her side, trying to offer what comfort I could. "It's going to be okay," I said, wishing I could believe my own words. "Help is on the way." The radio crackled to life, startling us all. "Huckleberry Station, this is dispatch. We've got units en route to your location, ETA 20 minutes. What's your situation?" The ranger who had made the initial call rushed to respond. "This is Cooper at Huckleberry. We're under attack by some kind of creature. It's trying to break in. We need immediate assistance." "Copy that, Huckleberry. Help is coming. Hold tight." 20 minutes. We just had to survive for 20 minutes. But as another bone-jarring impact shook the station, 20 minutes seemed like an eternity. "We need to barricade the windows and doors," Tyrese said, taking charge of the situation. His ranger training was kicking in, pushing aside his fear. "And we need weapons. Anything we can use to defend ourselves if that thing gets in." We sprang into action, dragging heavy filing cabinets in front of the windows and piling furniture against the door. The Rangers distributed what weapons they had: another handgun for Tyrese, a shotgun for me, and a large hunting knife for Marcella. As we worked, the creature continued its assault on the building. Each impact sent tremors through the floor, and the sound of splintering wood told us that our shelter wouldn't hold forever. "What do we do if it gets in before help arrives?" Marcella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Stevens, the ranger with the handgun, answered grimly, "We fight. We fight with everything we've got." The next few minutes passed in a blur of tense silence, punctuated by the creature's relentless attacks. We huddled in the center of the room, weapons at the ready, jumping at every sound. Suddenly, the assault stopped. The abrupt silence was almost as terrifying as the chaos that had preceded it. "Where did it go?" Cooper whispered, his eyes darting from window to window. As if in answer, a low, rumbling growl emanated from just outside the station. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate in our very bones, filling us with a primal terror. Then, slowly, deliberately, something began to scratch at the door. It wasn't the violent assault of before, but somehow this methodical approach was even more terrifying. It was as if the creature was taunting us, letting us know that it could get in whenever it wanted. "It's toying with us," I said, my mouth dry with fear. Tyrese nodded grimly. "It's intelligent. More intelligent than any animal I've ever encountered." The scratching continued, occasionally interspersed with that bone-chilling growl. Minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness, each second stretching into an eternity of terror. Then, just as the tension had reached an unbearable level, we heard it, the distant wail of sirens. "The backup," Cooper exclaimed, relief evident in his voice. "They're almost here." But our relief was short-lived. As soon as the sirens became audible, the creature let out a roar of frustration and renewed its assault on the station with even greater ferocity. "It knows it's running out of time," Stevens said, tightening his grip on his gun. The next few moments were a blur of splintering wood, shattering glass, and terrified screams. The creature, in its desperation, had redoubled its efforts to break in. And then, with a final thunderous crash, it succeeded. The barricaded door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and twisted metal. And there, framed in the doorway, stood the stuff of nightmares. In the harsh glare of the station's fluorescent lights, we could finally see the creature in all its horrifying detail. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its body a grotesque amalgamation of animal features. Matted fur covered most of its form, but in places I could see patches of scales or something that looked unsettlingly like human skin. Its limbs were long and jointed in impossible ways, ending in massive claws that looked capable of tearing through steel. But it was the creature's face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was vaguely lupine in shape, with a protruding snout filled with razor-sharp teeth. But where there should have been eyes, there were only swirling voids of absolute darkness. Looking into those eyeless sockets, I felt as if I was staring into the abyss itself. For a moment, everything was still. We stood frozen in terror, and even the creature seemed to pause, as if savoring our fear. Then, several things happened at once. Stevens and Tyrese opened fire, their guns blazing in the confined space of the station. The creature roared in pain and anger, a sound that threatened to burst our eardrums. And from outside, I heard the screech of tires as the backup finally arrived. What followed was a chaotic blur of gunfire, screams, and inhuman roars. The creature, wounded but far from defeated, lashed out with its massive claws. Cooper went down, a spray of blood marking where those terrible talons had caught him. I raised the shotgun, my hands shaking so badly I could barely aim. I fired, the recoil nearly knocking me off my feet. The creature staggered back, ichor spurting from multiple wounds, but it didn't fall. More gunshots rang out, this time from outside. The newly arrived officers had joined the fray, pouring fire into the station. The creature, realizing it was outmatched, let out one final, earth-shaking roar. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it turned and burst through one of the barricaded windows. In moments it had vanished into the darkness of the swamp, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. As the adrenaline began to fade, I became aware of the ringing in my ears, the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the metallic tang of blood in the air. Marcella was sobbing quietly, and Tyrese stood with his gun still raised, staring at the shattered window where the creature had escaped. Officers swarmed into the station, securing the area and calling for medical assistance. But even as they took charge of the situation, I knew that our ordeal was far from over. The creature was still out there, somewhere in the dark depths of Huckleberry Swamp, and something told me that this was just the beginning of a mystery that would change our lives forever. The hours following our encounter at the ranger station passed in a surreal blur. Paramedics arrived to treat our injuries. Marcella's sprained ankle, cuts and bruises for Tyrese and me, and more serious wounds for the unfortunate Ranger Cooper, who had taken the brunt of the creature's attack. As we were patched up, a steady stream of law enforcement officials arrived on the scene. Local police, state troopers, and even a few men in dark suits who refused to identify themselves beyond vague mentions of a federal task force. We were separated and questioned extensively. I found myself in one of the remaining intact rooms of the ranger station, sitting across from a stern-faced detective who introduced himself as Richard Hawthorne. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice gruff and no nonsense. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened tonight, and please don't leave anything out, no matter how unusual it might seem." I took a deep breath and began recounting the events of the night. As I spoke, describing our terrifying chase through the swamp and the nightmarish creature that had pursued us, I could see the skepticism growing in Detective Hawthorne's eyes. When I finished, he sat back in his chair, regarding me with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Mr. Thompson," he said slowly, "you do realize how this sounds, don't you?" I nodded wearily. "I know it sounds crazy. If I hadn't lived through it, I wouldn't believe it myself. But I swear to you, every word is true." Hawthorne sighed, rubbing his temples. As I reached down to help Marcella up, my flashlight beam caught something that made my blood run cold. Just inches from where she had fallen lay a weathered shoe, caked with mud and partially hidden by leaves. Next to it were scraps of torn fabric, dark stains marring the tattered cloth. "Oh God," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of our heavy breathing. Tyrese followed my gaze, his eyes widening as he took in the grisly scene. "We need to move," he said urgently, already bending down to help Marcella to her feet. "Can you walk?" Marcella nodded, grimacing as she put weight on her injured ankle. "I think so, but I'll be slow." "Lean on me," I offered, draping her arm over my shoulder. "We'll go as fast as we can." As we set off again, our pace significantly reduced by Marcella's injury. I couldn't help but think about the owner of that shoe. Was it the missing hiker, Martin Greaves? And if so, what had happened to him? The torn clothing and dark stains painted a gruesome picture in my mind. Our pursuer seemed to have fallen back, but I could still hear occasional crashes in the underbrush behind us, reminding us that we were far from safe. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions now, as if we were being surrounded. "What is that thing?" Marcella whispered, her voice tight with pain and fear. "I don't know," Tyrese replied, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness around us. "But whatever it is, it's not natural." As if to confirm his words, a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not quite animal, not quite human. The sound sent shivers down my spine and seemed to reverberate in my very bones. We pressed on, every step a struggle against the treacherous terrain and our own mounting terror. The oppressive darkness seemed to close in around us, our flashlights barely piercing the gloom. Strange whispers seemed to slide through the trees, just on the edge of hearing. A sour, musky stench filled the air, growing stronger with each passing moment. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flash of movement, too quick and too strange to properly process. But the glimpse I caught was enough to turn my blood to ice. It was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen or imagined. Its body was covered in mottled fur, matted and tangled with twigs and leaves. But it was the creature's shape that defied logic. Elongated limbs that seemed capable of bending in impossible ways, ending in viciously sharp claws. And its face. God, its face. In the brief moment I saw it, I noticed eyes like swirling pools of darkness, filled with a malevolent intelligence that was unmistakably predatory. "Run," I yelled, my voice cracking with terror. "It's right there." We abandoned all pretense of stealth, crashing through the underbrush in a desperate bid for survival. Marcella whimpered in pain with each step, but adrenaline kept her moving. Tyrese took the lead, using his superior strength to forge a path through the dense vegetation. Behind us, the creature let out a bone-chilling screech and gave chase. I could hear it moving through the forest with unnatural speed and agility, far outpacing what should have been possible in such dense undergrowth. "We can't outrun it," Marcella gasped, her face pale with pain and fear. She was right. With her injured ankle slowing us down, and the creature's inhuman speed, it was only a matter of time before it caught up to us. We needed a plan, and fast. "Tyrese," I shouted between ragged breaths. "Isn't there a ranger station nearby?" Tyrese's face lit up with sudden hope. "Yes, about half a mile east of here. If we can make it there, we might have a chance." With renewed determination, we changed course, heading east as best we could while navigating the treacherous swamp. Every splash of our feet in the shallow water seemed to echo in the unnaturally quiet forest. The creature's pursuit had gone silent, which was somehow even more terrifying than hearing it crash through the underbrush. As we struggled onward, I couldn't help but wonder about the nature of our pursuer. What was this thing that defied all logical explanation? Was it some kind of undiscovered species? A government experiment gone wrong? Or something even more sinister? Something that shouldn't exist in our rational scientific world? My musings were cut short as Tyrese suddenly stopped, holding up a hand for silence. For a moment, all I could hear was our labored breathing and the pounding of my own heart. Then faintly but unmistakably, I heard voices in the distance. "The ranger station," Tyrese whispered, his voice filled with relief. "We're almost there." But our relief was short-lived. From behind us came a sound that could only be described as a roar, a sound filled with rage and hunger that shook the very air around us. The creature had realized its prey was about to escape. "Go," I yelled, pushing Marcella forward. "Run for the station." We burst from the tree line into a small clearing. In the center stood a sturdy log building, the ranger station. Light spilled from its windows, a beacon of hope in the darkness that had surrounded us. As we sprinted across the open ground, I risked a glance back. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. The creature had emerged from the forest, its true form fully visible in the moonlight that now broke through the clouds. It was even more terrifying than the glimpses I'd caught before, a nightmarish amalgamation of animal and something utterly alien. Its eyes locked onto us, filled with an intelligence and malevolence that was unmistakably otherworldly. We reached the ranger station door just as the creature let out another ear-splitting roar. Tyrese wrenched the door open, and we tumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. Two startled rangers jumped to their feet, hands instinctively moving to their sidearms. "What the hell?" one of them exclaimed. "Lock the door," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "There's something out there." The rangers looked confused, but the terror in our eyes must have convinced them of the seriousness of the situation. One of them quickly secured the door while the other moved to the radio. "This is Ranger Stevens at Huckleberry Station," he said into the mic. "We have a situation here, requesting immediate backup." As the ranger called for help, I helped Marcella to a chair, finally able to examine her injured ankle. It was swollen and starting to bruise, but thankfully didn't appear to be broken. Tyrese was at the window, peering out into the darkness. "I don't see it," he muttered. "Where did it go?" As if in answer to his question, an unearthly howl split the night, causing us all to jump. It was close, too close. "What exactly is out there?" one of the rangers asked, his hand resting uneasily on his holstered gun. I opened my mouth to respond, but how could I possibly explain what we'd seen? How could I describe a creature that defied all logic and reason? Before I could formulate an answer, a tremendous crash shook the building. Wood splintered, and I turned just in time to see a monstrous clawed hand punching through the wall. The night was far from over, and our ordeal had only just begun. The ranger station erupted into chaos as the creature's massive clawed hand withdrew, leaving a gaping hole in the wall. Splinters of wood littered the floor, and the acrid smell of the beast's musk filled the air. "What the hell is that thing?" one of the rangers, the one who had been on the radio, shouted, his face pale with shock. "I don't know," Tyrese replied, his voice tight with fear. "But it's been chasing us through the swamp for the last hour." The other ranger, Stevens, I recalled, had drawn his sidearm and was aiming it at the hole in the wall. "Whatever it is, it's not getting in here," he declared, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Another crash rocked the building, this time from the roof. Dust and debris rained down on us as the creature's claws tore at the shingles, searching for a way in. Marcella whimpered in fear, clutching her injured ankle. I moved to her side, trying to offer what comfort I could. "It's going to be okay," I said, wishing I could believe my own words. "Help is on the way." The radio crackled to life, startling us all. "Huckleberry Station, this is dispatch. We've got units en route to your location, ETA 20 minutes. What's your situation?" The ranger who had made the initial call rushed to respond. "This is Cooper at Huckleberry. We're under attack by some kind of creature. It's trying to break in. We need immediate assistance." "Copy that, Huckleberry. Help is coming. Hold tight." 20 minutes. We just had to survive for 20 minutes. But as another bone-jarring impact shook the station, 20 minutes seemed like an eternity. "We need to barricade the windows and doors," Tyrese said, taking charge of the situation. His ranger training was kicking in, pushing aside his fear. "And we need weapons. Anything we can use to defend ourselves if that thing gets in." We sprang into action, dragging heavy filing cabinets in front of the windows and piling furniture against the door. The Rangers distributed what weapons they had: another handgun for Tyrese, a shotgun for me, and a large hunting knife for Marcella. As we worked, the creature continued its assault on the building. Each impact sent tremors through the floor, and the sound of splintering wood told us that our shelter wouldn't hold forever. "What do we do if it gets in before help arrives?" Marcella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Stevens, the ranger with the handgun, answered grimly. We fight with everything we've got." The next few minutes passed in a blur of tense silence punctuated by the creature's relentless attacks. We huddled in the center of the room, weapons at the ready, jumping at every sound. Suddenly, the assault stopped. The abrupt silence was almost as terrifying as the chaos that had preceded it. "Where did it go?" Cooper whispered, his eyes darting from window to window. As if in answer, a low rumbling growl emanated from just outside the station. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate in our very bones, filling us with a primal terror. Then slowly, deliberately, something began to scratch at the door. It wasn't the violent assault of before, but somehow this methodical approach was even more terrifying. It was as if the creature was taunting us, letting us know that it could get in whenever it wanted. "It's toying with us," I said, my mouth dry with fear. Tyrese nodded grimly. "It's intelligent. More intelligent than any animal I've ever encountered." The scratching continued, occasionally interspersed with that bone-chilling growl. Minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness, each second stretching into an eternity of terror. Then, just as the tension had reached an unbearable level, we heard it, the distant wail of sirens. "The backup," Cooper exclaimed, relief evident in his voice. "They're almost here." But our relief was short-lived. As soon as the sirens became audible, the creature let out a roar of frustration and renewed its assault on the station with even greater ferocity. "It knows it's running out of time," Stevens said, tightening his grip on his gun. The next few moments were a blur of splintering wood, shattering glass, and terrified screams. The creature, in its desperation, had redoubled its efforts to break in. And then, with a final thunderous crash, it succeeded. The barricaded door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and twisted metal. And there, framed in the doorway, stood the stuff of nightmares. In the harsh glare of the station's fluorescent lights, we could finally see the creature in all its horrifying detail. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its body a grotesque amalgamation of animal features. Matted fur covered most of its form, but in places I could see patches of scales or something that looked unsettlingly like human skin. Its limbs were long and jointed in impossible ways, ending in massive claws that looked capable of tearing through steel. But it was the creature's face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was vaguely lupine in shape, with a protruding snout filled with razor-sharp teeth, but where there should have been eyes, there were only swirling voids of absolute darkness. Looking into those eyeless sockets, I felt as if I was staring into the abyss itself. For a moment, everything was still. We stood frozen in terror, and even the creature seemed to pause as if savoring our fear. Then, several things happened at once. Stevens and Tyrese opened fire, their guns blazing in the confined space of the station. The creature roared in pain and anger, a sound that threatened to burst our eardrums. And from outside I heard the screech of tires as the backup finally arrived. What followed was a chaotic blur of gunfire, screams, and inhuman roars. The creature, wounded but far from defeated, lashed out with its massive claws. Cooper went down, a spray of blood marking where those terrible talons had caught him. I raised the shotgun, my hands shaking so badly I could barely aim. I fired, the recoil nearly knocking me off my feet. The creature staggered back, ichor spurting from multiple wounds, but it didn't fall. More gunshots rang out, this time from outside. The newly arrived officers had joined the fray, pouring fire into the station. The creature, realizing it was outmatched, let out one final, earth-shaking roar. Then, with a speed that defied its size, it turned and burst through one of the barricaded windows. In moments it had vanished into the darkness of the swamp, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. As the adrenaline began to fade, I became aware of the ringing in my ears, the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the metallic tang of blood in the air. Marcella was sobbing quietly, and Tyrese stood with his gun still raised, staring at the shattered window where the creature had escaped. Officers swarmed into the station, securing the area and calling for medical assistance. But even as they took charge of the situation, I knew that our ordeal was far from over. The creature was still out there, somewhere in the dark depths of Huckleberry Swamp, and something told me that this was just the beginning of a mystery that would change our lives forever. The hours following our encounter at the ranger station passed in a surreal blur. Paramedics arrived to treat our injuries. Marcella's sprained ankle, cuts and bruises for Tyrese and me, and more serious wounds for the unfortunate Ranger Cooper, who had taken the brunt of the creature's attack. As we were patched up, a steady stream of law enforcement officials arrived on the scene. Local police, state troopers, and even a few men in dark suits who refused to identify themselves beyond vague mentions of a federal task force. We were separated and questioned extensively. I found myself in one of the remaining intact rooms of the ranger station, sitting across from a stern-faced detective who introduced himself as Richard Hawthorne. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice gruff and no nonsense. "I need you to tell me exactly what happened tonight, and please, don't leave anything out, no matter how long." I took a deep breath and began recounting the events of the night. As I spoke, describing our terrifying chase through the swamp and the nightmarish creature that had pursued us, I could see the skepticism growing in Detective Hawthorne's eyes. When I finished, he sat back in his chair, regarding me with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Mr. Thompson," he said slowly, "you do realize how this sounds, don't you?" I nodded wearily. "I know it sounds crazy. If I hadn't lived through it, I wouldn't believe it myself. But I swear to you every word is true." Hawthorne sighed, rubbing his temples. When Reeves looked up, her face was pale. "We've got a problem," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "These tracks, they're not just from one creature anymore." A chill ran down my spine as we all gathered around to look. Sure enough, mingled with the now familiar prints of our quarry were other, equally disturbing tracks. Some were similar but smaller, as if made by juvenile versions of the creature. Others were completely different. Long, sinuous marks that looked like they'd been made by something serpentine, and what appeared to be huge bird-like tracks with wickedly curved talons. "What does this mean?" Marcella asked, her voice trembling slightly. Hawthorne's face was grim. "It means we're dealing with more than just one monster. There's a whole ecosystem of these things out here." The implications of his words hit us like a physical blow. One creature had been terrifying enough. The thought of an entire population of these things was almost too much to bear. "We need to turn back," Tyrese said, voicing what we were all thinking. "We're not equipped to handle this." But before anyone could respond, a blood-curdling screech split the air. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Part bird, part big cat, and part something utterly alien. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through the trees and making the very ground beneath our feet tremble. "Run," Reeves yelled, all pretense of stealth abandoned. We took off, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic. I could hear something moving through the canopy above us, branches snapping and leaves rustling as it kept pace effortlessly. Suddenly, Marcella cried out. I turned to see her stumble and fall, her foot caught in a tangle of roots. Without thinking, I rushed back to help her. As I reached down to free her foot, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked up just in time to see a massive shape descending from the trees. It was like the creature we'd encountered in the swamp, but different. This one was sleeker, its limbs even more elongated, ending in what looked like hooked talons. Its body was covered in a mix of scales and feathers, and its head was distinctly avian, with a wickedly curved beak. Time seemed to slow down as the creature fell towards us. I could see every detail with horrifying clarity. The iridescent sheen of its feathers, the saliva dripping from its beak, the swirling voids of its eyes fixed on us with predatory intent. Just as I thought it was all over, a deafening bang rang out. The creature screeched in pain and veered off course, crashing into the underbrush a few feet away from us. Hawthorne stood there, his gun still smoking. "Go," he yelled. "I'll hold it off." I didn't need to be told twice. I hauled Marcella to her feet, and we ran. Behind us I could hear more gunshots, interspersed with inhuman screeches and the sound of something large thrashing through the vegetation. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like they were made of lead. Finally, we burst out of the dense forest into a small clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and empty. "In there," Reeves called out, already moving towards the structure. We piled inside, slamming the door shut behind us. The interior was musty and filled with cobwebs, but it was shelter. Tyrese and I quickly began barricading the door and windows with whatever furniture we could find. As the adrenaline began to wear off, I realized Hawthorne wasn't with us. "Where's the detective?" I asked, looking around frantically. Reeves' face was grim. He stayed behind to give us a chance to escape. We can only hope he made it out alive. A heavy silence fell over us as the reality of our situation sank in. We were trapped in an unknown part of the forest, surrounded by creatures that defied explanation, with no idea if help was coming. As night began to fall, casting long shadows through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, we huddled together in the center of the cabin. The sounds of the forest outside had changed, filled now with strange calls and movements that sent shivers down our spines. "What do we do now?" Marcella whispered, her voice tight with fear. Reeves checked her weapon, her face set in grim determination. "We survive the night, and come morning we find a way out of this forest. Whatever's happening here, it's bigger than we thought. We need to get this information to people who can help." As we settled in for a long, terrifying night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stumbled upon something far more significant than a simple monster hunt. The creatures, the strange forest, the legends of Witch's Hollow, it all hinted at a mystery far deeper and more dangerous than we could have imagined. Little did we know, our ordeal in the cabin that night would be just the beginning of a journey that would take us to the very edge of reality, challenging everything we thought we knew about the world and our place in it. The cabin creaked and groaned around us as the wind picked up outside. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the flickering light of the single lantern Reeves had in her pack. We had pushed all the furniture to the center of the room, creating a small fortress where we now huddled, backs to each other, facing outward towards the windows and doors. Every sound from outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Was that just the wind in the trees, or something more sinister? Was that scratching at the door just branches being blown against the wood, or claws seeking entry? "We should take turns keeping watch," Reeves said, her voice low but steady. 2-hour shifts. I'll take first watch." We nodded in agreement, grateful for her calm leadership in this nightmare scenario. As the others tried to get some rest, I found myself unable to close my eyes. Every time I did, I saw that bird-like creature descending from the trees, its void-like eyes fixed on me with murderous intent. About an hour into Reeves' watch, a new sound cut through the night, a low, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was joined by another, then another, until the air was filled with an otherworldly chorus that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "What is that?" Marcella whispered, sitting up from where she had been trying to sleep. Tyrese, his ranger training evident in the way he cocked his head to listen, frowned deeply. "It's not like any animal call I've ever heard. It's almost like they're singing." As we listened, I realized he was right. There was a haunting melody to the sounds, a rhythm that pulsed through the air and seemed to resonate in our very bones. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, like a siren's song luring sailors to their doom. Suddenly, Reeves stiffened. "Look," she hissed, pointing towards one of the boarded-up windows. We all turned to look, and I felt my heart skip a beat. Through a small gap in the planks, I could see movement outside. Shapes were moving in the darkness, fluid and ethereal. They seemed to glow faintly with an inner light, casting eerie shadows as they danced through the trees. "What are they?" I whispered, unable to tear my eyes away from the mesmerizing sight. "I don't know," Reeves replied, her voice tight with tension. "But whatever they are, they're not natural." As we watched, transfixed, one of the shapes drew closer to the cabin. It paused just outside the window, and for a moment I could make out more details. It was vaguely humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, too fluid, as if they weren't constrained by bones or joints. Its head was elongated and eyeless, with a mouth that seemed to take up half its face. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned to face the window. Even though it had no eyes, I felt with absolute certainty that it was looking directly at me. A voice, not heard with my ears but felt in my mind, whispered, "Come out, join us, become one with the forest." I recoiled, scrambling backwards until my back hit the far wall of the cabin. The others looked at me in alarm. "What's wrong?" Tyrese asked, reaching out to steady me. I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. How could I describe the alien presence I had felt in my mind, the terrifying allure of its invitation? Before I could find my voice, a new sound cut through the night, a human scream, filled with pain and terror. We all froze, exchanging horrified glances. "That came from the east," Reeves said, already moving towards the door. "Someone's out there." "We can't go out there," Marcella protested. "Those things are still out there." Reeves paused, her hand on the makeshift barricade. "We can't just leave someone to die. Besides, it could be Hawthorne." The mention of the detective's name settled it. We couldn't abandon him, not after he had risked his life to save us. Quickly and quietly, we removed the barricade from the door. Reeves took point, her rifle at the ready. Tyrese and I flanked Marcella, who was still limping slightly from her earlier fall. As we stepped out into the night, the ethereal shapes in the forest seemed to retreat, melting back into the shadows. The haunting melody faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. We moved as quietly as we could through the underbrush, following the direction of the scream. The forest around us felt alive in a way that had nothing to do with normal wildlife. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and more than once I caught glimpses of glowing eyes watching us from the darkness. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we came to a small clearing. What we saw there would haunt my nightmares for years to come. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its trunk easily 10 feet in diameter. But this was no ordinary tree. Its bark seemed to pulse with an inner light, and its branches moved and writhed like tentacles. And there, half absorbed into the trunk, was a human figure. With a jolt of horror, I recognized Hawthorne. He was alive, but barely. His lower body had been pulled into the tree, the bark growing over his skin. His face was a mask of pain and terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. As we stood there, frozen in shock and horror, Hawthorne's eyes found us. "Run," he managed to gasp out. "It's a trap. They're not what they seem. The whole forest is alive." His words were cut off as the tree pulsed, pulling him deeper into its trunk. In moments, he had vanished entirely, leaving no trace that he had ever been there. For a long moment, we stood in stunned silence. Then, as one, we turned to run, but it was too late. The clearing was no longer empty. Surrounding us on all sides were the creatures we had glimpsed earlier, the bird-like one that had attacked us, the ethereal dancers, and others too strange and terrible to describe. And behind them all, towering over everything, was a shape that could only be our original quarry from the swamp. As the creatures closed in, I realized with a sinking feeling that we had never been the hunters. From the very beginning, we had been the prey, and now, deep in this impossible forest, our hunt had come to its inevitable, terrifying conclusion. The true nature of Witch's Hollow, and the dark secret at the heart of the forest, was about to be revealed, and I feared that the knowledge would come at a cost higher than any of us were prepared to pay. Time seemed to stand still as we faced the nightmarish menagerie that surrounded us. The creatures were unlike anything I had ever seen or imagined, a twisted menagerie that defied the laws of nature and sanity. The bird-like creature that had attacked us earlier was there, its feathers gleaming with an oily iridescence in the dim light. Beside it stood something that looked like a cross between a wolf and a praying mantis, its multiple limbs ending in wickedly sharp claws. The ethereal dancers we had glimpsed from the cabin window swayed hypnotically, their forms constantly shifting and changing. And there, looming over them all, was the creature from the swamp. Seeing it again, in the heart of its domain, I realized that our memories hadn't done it justice. It was even more terrifying than I remembered. A massive, hulking form that seemed to be composed of shadow and malevolence given flesh. As we stood there, frozen in terror, I felt a presence brush against my mind. It was alien and vast, a consciousness so foreign that my brain struggled to comprehend it. And then, to my shock, it spoke. "Welcome," a voice resonated in my head, somehow conveying amusement and hunger in equal measure. "We've been waiting for you." I glanced at the others and saw from their expressions that they were hearing it too. Reeves had her rifle raised, but her hands were shaking. Tyrese stood protectively in front of Marcella, though what protection he could offer against these beings, I couldn't imagine. What are you?" I managed to stammer out, my voice barely above a whisper. The massive creature tilted its head, an eerily human gesture on such an inhuman form. "We are the Forest," it replied, the capital F evident in its mental voice. "We are the guardians of the spaces between worlds, the keepers of secrets long forgotten by your kind." "But you've been killing people," Marcella said, her voice trembling but determined. "The missing hiker, the attacks at the campground." A ripple of what might have been laughter passed through the assembled creatures. "Killing?" the voice in our head said. "No, not killing. Transforming, elevating. Those who enter our domain are given a choice, to become one with the forest, or to leave this plane of existence entirely." With a gesture from the massive creature, the tree that had absorbed Hawthorne began to move. Its bark split open, revealing a writhing mass of tendrils and pulsing organic matter. And there, in the center, was Hawthorne, or what used to be Hawthorne. His body had been transformed, merged with the living tissue of the tree. His skin was now bark, his hair leaves and moss, and his eyes were now the same swirling voids that all the creatures shared. "He chose to join us," the forest said, "as have many others over the centuries. And now you must make the same choice." The revelation hit us like a physical blow. The idea that Hawthorne, and who knows how many others, had willingly chosen to become this, was almost too much to comprehend. "You're lying," Reeves said, her voice shaking but defiant. "No one would choose this." The forest's amusement rippled through our minds. "Are you so sure? Think of the knowledge we offer, the power, the chance to be part of something greater than your limited human existence." As it spoke, I felt a strange pull in my mind. Visions flashed before my eyes, glimpses of other worlds, of knowledge beyond human comprehension, of power that defied the laws of physics. It was intoxicating, terrifying, and utterly alien. I shook my head, trying to clear it. Beside me, I could see the others struggling with similar visions. Marcella had fallen to her knees, her eyes wide and unfocused. Tyrese was gritting his teeth, his hands clenched into fists as he fought against the mental assault. "Stop it," I yelled, both out loud and in my mind. "Leave us alone." To my surprise, the vision ceased. The forest seemed to regard us with renewed interest. "Interesting," it mused. "Your will is stronger than most. Perhaps that is why you were drawn here." "Drawn here?" Reeves asked, her voice hoarse. "What do you mean? Did you think it was mere chance that led you to our domain?" The forest replied. "We have been calling to you, to all of you, since your first encounter in the swamp. You are special, chosen, and now you must decide: join us or perish." The creatures around us began to close in, their forms shifting and writhing in ways that hurt to look at. I felt panic rising in my chest. We were outnumbered, outmatched, and had nowhere to run. But then, just as all hope seemed lost, Tyrese spoke up. "Wait," he said, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. "You said we have a choice. That means you can't force us to join you, right?" The forest paused, and I felt a flicker of something. Uncertainty? Respect? It was hard to tell with such an alien consciousness. "That is correct," it finally admitted. "The choice must be willing. It is the central tenet of our existence." "Then I choose to leave," Tyrese said firmly. "We all do. Let us go, and we won't tell anyone about this place. It'll remain your secret." For a long moment there was silence. The creatures around us remained still, awaiting the forest's decision. I held my breath, hardly daring to hope. Finally the forest spoke. "Your offer is acceptable. But know this. Once you leave, you can never return. The knowledge of this place will fade from your minds, becoming nothing more than a half-remembered dream. And should you ever speak of what you've seen here, no one will believe you." Relief washed over me, so intense it made my knees weak. We were going to survive. We were going to go home. But then Marcella spoke up, her voice quiet but clear. "What if one of us wanted to stay?" We all turned to look at her in shock. She was still on her knees, but her eyes were clear now, filled with a mixture of fear and wonder. "Marcella, no," I said, reaching out to her. "You can't." She looked at me, tears in her eyes. "But don't you see, Jake? The things they could teach us, the worlds we could explore, it's everything I've ever dreamed of." The forest's satisfaction was palpable. "The choice is yours," it said. "But choose quickly. The offer will not remain open indefinitely." For a moment I thought we'd lost her, but then Tyrese knelt down beside her, taking her hand. "Marcella," he said gently, "I know it's tempting, but think about your family, your friends. Think about all the good you can do in our world. We need you there." Marcella hesitated, torn between two impossible choices. Then, slowly, she nodded. "You're right," she whispered. "I want to go home." The forest's disappointment was clear, but it made no move to stop us. "So be it," it said. "Go now, and do not look back. For if you do, you may find yourselves unable to leave." We didn't need to be told twice. Supporting each other, we turned and began to make our way out of the clearing. True to the forest's word, none of the creatures tried to stop us. As we walked, I could feel the memory of what had happened already beginning to fade. The details were becoming fuzzy, the terror less acute. By the time we reached the edge of Witch's Hollow, it felt more like a particularly vivid nightmare than reality. We emerged from the forest as dawn was breaking, the pale light of the sun feeling alien after the otherworldly glow of the forest. A search and rescue team found us a few hours later, dehydrated and exhausted, but alive. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to piece together what had happened, but true to the forest's word, our memories were fragmented and dreamlike. We couldn't agree on the details, and the more we tried to remember, the more it slipped away. The official report listed Hawthorne as missing, presumed dead. The attacks were attributed to an unusually aggressive bear, which was supposedly hunted down and killed. Life, it seemed, was determined to return to normal. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring out at the distant tree line, and for just a moment I swear I can hear a faint, otherworldly melody carried on the wind. In those moments I feel a pull, an urge to return to the forest and the impossible choice we left behind. But I resist. I made my choice, and I have to believe it was the right one. The forest and its secrets remain hidden, a mystery that will haunt the edges of my consciousness for the rest of my days. And yet, I can't help but wonder, what if we had chosen differently? What wonders and horrors might we have discovered? The question lingers, unanswered and unanswerable, a reminder of the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown terrors that lurk just out of sight.